everyone, and welcome to another ramble. This time I wanted to talk a little bit about, recently in the news you may have seen, if you're interested in this type of thing, an announcement from the company SpaceX that they want to colonize Mars. If you're not really interested in that type of thing, it may have flown over your head, but I think it's an interesting thing to just kind of talk about, even if you're not that interested in space travel, that type of thing. Now, I read an article on it. It was a fantastic article on a website called Wait But Why, and I'll put a link in the description if you want to read it too. And basically I'm just going to be going over the points in this article and stuff like that, with a few of my own opinions and stuff like that. Now, if you're unaware of what SpaceX is, it's basically a private NASA. So they have rockets which they put, companies pay them to deliver payloads into space, usually satellites, that type of thing. Instead of that company paying NASA, which is traditionally funded by the government, there's this company SpaceX which is kind of doing it, and that kind of works out quite well because funding from government into space programs has been cut a lot, especially since the days of the kind of Cold War and stuff like that, when we actually put a man on the moon. The funding just isn't there now, it's being spent on other things. SpaceX is a company owned by Elon Musk, who you may have heard of. He also owns Tesla and PayPal. He made his fortune on PayPal, and then he decided to, I guess, save the world, or something like that. He's a very interesting man, whatever your opinion is of him, and he is, he's obviously a very clever man as well. So yeah, that's effectively what SpaceX do now. They've kind of been getting bigger and bigger. The big thing they've tried to focus on is reusability, because space travel is very expensive. Usually it's a giant rocket booster which burns up on re-entry, or is never used again, never seen again, and it requires a lot of materials, and it's a very wasteful process. But they've tried to focus on reusability, so their actual rockets come back down to land, and things like that. So we'll touch more on that later, but they're trying to kind of bring the price of space travel down, as it were. So yeah, they've come out and said that they want to colonize Mars. Why? That would probably be the first question, wouldn't it? I mean, we have the Earth, and that's a very habitable planet. Mars isn't a very habitable planet. So why go through all that expense and bother to do that? Well, there's a couple of answers to that. The first one is, when you think about humans, we always kind of push ourselves. We push ourselves to achieve more. As a species, the thing which has kind of defined us from animals is our ability to learn and our eagerness to discover things, and that's what's pushed us forward technologically, socially, and to just stay on Earth for the rest of kind of humanity's lifespan, or however long it is, would be, well, it wouldn't be, if you think about in the past, you have people like Christopher Columbus, who set sail and discovered America, these great explorers, Marco Polo, who went to China. It's kind of a similar sort of thing. There's this kind of, I think there's this drive within all humans, that's stronger in some than others, to explore, to discover, and to just push ourselves as a race, as a species, to that next level. And it's exciting as well, the second one is really more practical. It's not a good idea to have all our eggs in one basket. So right now we're all on Earth. If something really bad happened on Earth, either a natural disaster or one of our own making, there would be nothing left. Imagine if you had some really important data that you wanted to keep. Would you just keep it on one hard drive, or would you make a backup? It's kind of essentially the same thing, Having a colony on a different planet, or many different planets, kind of safeguards the future of humanity to a certain extent. And then I guess the next question you have is, why Mars? Well, the other planets in the solar system are not really viable. They're either too far away, or at least they're moons which are habitable in terms of like Saturn, Jupiter, things like that. Or they're just not habitable at all. So, Venus, it's just way too hot. Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, they're just balls of gas. So Mars is the best planet. Why not the Moon? Well, the Moon doesn't have any natural resources, really. Its days are 28 Earth days long. It has no atmosphere, and it has no protection against the sun as a result of that. So it's just not a great place to live, basically, on the Moon, even though it's a lot closer. So Mars. Another thing to remember about Mars is that if it existed on Earth, as this article says, it would basically be somewhere no one would ever go to. It's just a horrible place, really. Nothing grows there. It's there's no running water. There's no atmosphere. Well, there's no air, shall we say. You wouldn't go there. But what it does have is potentially frozen water, although deep down, its gravity isn't too far off Earth's, so it's not too bad, and its days are not too far off Earth's either, so it's got some kind of things going for it which you can't potentially change. So Mars is realistically the kind of best hope within our solar system to colonize, realistically. So why do they want to put 1 million people on Mars? I mean, that's a high number, isn't it? Maybe you think like, 100 people, 1,000 people, 10,000, why 1 million? It's a rough estimate. It's a rough estimate of what you would need for a self-sustaining community. So that means that even if you had no way of getting back to Earth or getting any supplies, the colony would still be able to survive. So you don't want to have a colony on Mars, which you're building there, so that if something bad happens on Earth, you can, you don't want to have it reliant on Earth, because then if something bad happens on Earth, Mars will just crumble. So you have to have it to be sustainable. So yeah, that's why kind of it sounds like a high number, but that's kind of what they believe is necessary to take someone to Mars. So the question now you're thinking, probably like I was, is, well, how on earth do you take 1 million people to Mars? We took 3 people to the Moon and they barely got back. To begin with, we've taken more since then. And there's a kind of a diagram in this article, and you have circles. One, people who can afford to go to Mars, people who want to go to Mars, and where they cross over, that's the million people you need to go there. Now, the issue at the minute would be that the cost of going to Mars is astronomically high, and there are not a million people who can afford to do that. And even if there was, how many of those people would want to go to Mars? I mean, if you sit there now and think to yourself, even if there was a fully self-sustained colony on Mars, someone said to you, you can go there, you can come back, would you really go? I mean, it would be something to see, but there's obviously a lot of risks involved. So the idea is that if you can get the circle of people who can afford to go to Mars big enough, then the other circle of people who want to go to Mars will also increase, because you're just increasing the overall numbers, if that makes sense. So that's effectively kind of what they need to focus on. Now, last time the US Congress checked with NASA, the cost to send a 5-person crew to Mars was $50 billion. So that's $10 billion per person. Elon Musk thinks that in order to make the section of people who can afford to go to Mars big enough to have enough who want to go, it would need to cost $500,000 per person. 1/20,000th of the current cost. So effectively, there's a great analogy here which says, if you're looking at the car industry and saying right now a new Honda costs about $20,000, to make this a viable industry we need to get the cost of that car down to $1. So how on earth do you do that? It seems impossible, doesn't it? So effectively the way that rockets work at the minute, imagine if you were on a plane and if the plane went, you were flying to, say, Australia. If you lived somewhere else, you lived in Europe and you're flying to Australia, for example, and instead of taking off and then going to land, you take off, but then just as you get to Australia, everybody jumps out with a parachute and the plane goes off and crashes into the ocean. So every single time they have to fly a plane to Australia, you have to build a new plane. Okay? So the plane ticket would be massively more expensive because you keep having to do that. You can't just use one plane. So the kind of theory that SpaceX have is that if they can build something which they can reuse, then they cut that cost right down, you know. Effectively, if they can build an aeroplane which can get them from Earth to Mars and do multiple trips, the cost of those trips will come down to a point whereby it will be affordable. Kind of sounds easy, doesn't it? It's not really, obviously, or else we probably would have done it. So effectively all they'd be paying for was fuel. Then they can do certain other things, like for example, if they can refuel the spaceship in orbit, that cuts the cost by a lot. If they could manufacture fuel on Mars itself for the return trip, that cuts the cost a lot more. So essentially the way they've worked it out is they think they could eventually get the cost under $100,000 per person for a ticket to Mars. That's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. Now to you that might be like, well, I don't have $100,000 so it's irrelevant, you know, how many people worth that amount of money to spend, but if you think about it, it wouldn't necessarily be a case of like, oh, you have to pay this much. It would probably be more of a case of like grants and things like that for people to go. so it wouldn't necessarily be like that. Obviously, the first people to go would be people with skills and things like that, so they would be looking for certain people, but eventually down the line, I guess that's more of a kind of a touristy cost, as it were. So, when you think of it like that, it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Now, if we go on to the rocket, so this is what is needed to actually get you to Mars. So, the first thing to remember with this is that I'm going to talk about this rocket, but they're actually building it right now. So this isn't some pipe dream where they're like, okay, we're going to plan it all, and if we can get this amount of money, and if we can do this, then we can. No, they're doing it now. They're building this rocket. It's crazy. It really is. So, the first thing to think about. So this article says, first let's absorb the challenge at hand. It's often said that space is hard to this day. Only a few hundred people have been in space. Only a few countries have the ability to launch something into space, and the history of human space travel is littered with tragic launch failures. Firing something super heavy and delicate and fuel full of explosive liquid up into the atmosphere without anything going wrong is incredibly hard. But when we talk about humans going into space, we're talking mostly about humans going into low Earth orbit, a layer of space between 100 and 1200 miles above the ground. Normally they're heading only 250 miles up to the International Space Station. The only time humans have gone further were a small handful of Americans who made it out to the moon in the 1960s, travelling about 250,000 miles away. When Earth and Mars are at their closest, Mars is somewhere between 34 and 60 million miles away. That's 200 times further away than the Moon, and 200,000 times further away than the International Space Station. The Moon is just over 1 light second away from us. Mars is more than 3 light minutes away. So Mars is far. That's the point. Mars is really far away. It's probably, to me, it's incomprehensible, that distance. I don't even know how many times around the world you would be going, but it would be a lot. Space is huge. The furthest man's ever gone is to the moon, and this distance is way more times than that. So Elon Musk likes to compare Earth to Mars trip to crossing the Atlantic Ocean. So noting that using that scale, going to the moon would be crossing the English Channel, and going to the International Space Station would be going to a dock 117 feet off the shore. So, continuing with that comparison, a rocket made to go to low Earth orbit, or even the moon, is basically like a coastal fishing vessel compared to a colonial transport system that's trying to go 1,000 times further. So, it's a long way. A long, long way. On top of that, it might be worth it to take only a few humans or single satellite up into low Earth orbit. But if you're going all the way to Mars, you want to take a lot more than that. So you have to take much more mass much further, multiplying the distance factor by the payload factor. It's literally 1,000,000 times more capable than what the current world launch system can do. That's what the SpaceX system has to be. Because if you think about it, the supplies you need to get to the moon, it's so much further, so you have to have more supplies. Makes sense. Also, if you're going to be building a colony, you're going to need way more supplies. So all SpaceX have to do is build a rocket that's 1,000,000 times more capable than today's best rockets. That's also efficient, smart, can be reused multiple times, and that's what they're doing. That's what they're building. There's some pictures on this website about the scale of it. It's just huge. Basically, it's as tall as a skyscraper. It's going to be the biggest flying object that has ever existed. It's kind of mind blowing to think that human beings have come to the point where, really only 150, 200 years ago we were mucking around with just trying to fly, and now we're at a point whereby we're talking about sending men to Mars. It's really quite incredible. I often think about the speed at which the last sort of, if you take 100 years ago from today, and compare it to how we are today, and then take 1,000 years from that date, that 1,000 years we've made more technological advances in the last 100 years than in the 1,000 years before that. We'll probably make more technological advances in the next 10 years than we have in the last 100 years. The speed at which humans are discovering more things and learning about stuff is, quite incredible. If you think the smartphone you use on a daily basis is more powerful than the computers that sent the man to the moon, it's kind of mind blowing. And think about how small they are. And the computers which sent people to the moon were big, huge rooms. So yeah, it's not inconceivable to think that this is really going to happen. So the name of the rocket is called the Mars Colonial Transporter. For now, it might change, but that's what it's called for now, and it is just huge. The idea of the current SpaceX rockets is called the Falcon 9, and it would be able to take 4 tons of payload to Mars. The next one up, which is just around, they're just starting to use it now, is called the Falcon Heavy, and it would be able to take 13 tons to Mars. But the one they're building, the biggest one, the Mars Colonial Transport, will eventually be able to take 1,000 tons to Mars. That's absolutely immense. Now, obviously, to have a rocket that big, you're going to need something to power it. The size of the booster is 25 stories high. It's the biggest booster of all time by physical size, and even more so by thrust. The Falcon 9 has 9 Merlin engines, and each one is powerful enough to lift a stack of 40 cars up into the sky in total. So the Falcon 9 could lift 360 cars up, so that's the one they use at the minute. The Falcon Heavy has 27 engines and could lift a stack of over 1,000 cars up past the clouds. So a single Raptor engine, which is being used to power the Mars Colonial Transport, can lift 310 tons, or 172 cars, or an entire Boeing 747. And Mars Colonial Transport has 42 of them, so it's really, really quite incredible. there's lots of info on it, which I kind of won't bore you on, but it's just fascinating to think kind of what it would be like to go to Mars. And they've got a kind of a short explanation of how the trip would go if you were going yourself. So, first of all, you'd get on the ship, taking off from Cape Canaveral in Florida, which is the same pad where the Apollo astronauts took off from. That is because the pad was built to be absurdly large, since they didn't know yet how big a rocket they'd be using. The next stage would be the takeoff. So you strap in, and in a few minutes, you're up, and the booster rocket separates from the main kind of colonial transport module, really. So kind of like modern day rockets, where you see the boosters, once they're empty of fuel, they just kind of detach and drop off. The difference being that the SpaceX ones would be reusable, so they would drop off and they'd go back down to Earth, and they'd be able to reuse them, thus saving cost. Once that kind of once the booster rocket's off and the main spaceship's there, that refuels in orbit. So the idea would be that it would have something in orbit, maybe another spaceship there, which can refuel it, so that it can then set off to Mars. Because obviously, the idea being that getting something from the ground into space is very, very hard because of gravity. Like the Earth's gravity doesn't want you to do that, and the heavier your rocket is, the more thrust you need to give to use it. So if you're having to put all the fuel you need on it to get to Mars, then you're having to use more fuel, more thrust to get that into orbit. So the idea being that you can kind of have a tanker which will go from Earth and up, and kind of fill up tanks, and then the rocket would be able to refuel in Earth's orbit before going off to Mars. Because obviously, once you're in space, it's a lot easier to move because there's no atmosphere whatsoever. So the journey to Mars would take around about 3 months, which, when you think about it, is not that bad. I don't know offhand how long it took people to get from Europe to America in the olden days. I imagine it was over a month or so to cross the Atlantic Ocean, and people, were kind of quite happy to do that. So I think 3 months is unreasonable. So once you get to Mars, you kind of have to land on it. That basically does it in the same way that the booster rockets would do. So it would kind of come bottom first, as it were, and then kind of land that way, if you imagine, rather than like a plane or anything like that. And then people would set up a colony on Mars. That would be the first step. Obviously, building somewhere where people can live, where they can, you can build crops, things like that. If you've seen the movie The Martian, you'll kind of know the sort of thing, but on a much grander scale. And then eventually the idea would be that you could make your own kind of liquid oxygen fuel on Mars in order to be able to take the rocket back. And once you have that all set up, then you can send the rocket back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and that's essentially how you're going to get the people there. It's kind of simple when you think about it. It's kind of incredibly simple to think about, but like the actual thoughts of it would be, it would take around about 10,000 flights to get that million people to Mars. That's a lot. That's a long time. It's kind of crazy to think that, it doesn't seem to. I don't know really. It's just, for me, it's kind of crazy to think that that's so simple to kind of do, and that possibly within my lifetime they're looking at kind of sending cargo and things like that by 2020, and then by 2025 the first people would be going. So you think about that, that's 9 years away. It's not even very long, is it? So generally, probably within the lifetime of everybody listening and watching this video, people will be on Mars, so long as everything goes to plan, I guess. And that's kind of amazing. I mean, it will bring up so many more kind of interesting kind of discussions once it's there. I mean, who owns Mars? Do the people who are there, do they own Mars? It's kind of crazy. Will people who are born on Mars, will they have citizenship of Earth? Which country would it be? There's so many things to think about. And then, I guess by what you're thinking, from Mars, where do we go from there? I mean, they're kind of talking that by kind of 2035 there will be a significant number of people on Mars. It's not inconceivable to think that by the next century we could be on other planets as well, because once you get on Mars you then have a base where you can then go on from there, and there are many kind of moons around Jupiter and Saturn which could possibly be habitable. So it's kind of crazy to think about things like that. I play games like Elite Dangerous, No Man's Sky, and in that a lot of things are taken for granted. You just kind of accept things like space flight, and you just think of it as science fiction. It's not really real. But we're coming to a point whereby science fiction is beginning to come true in a way. And it's kind of scary, but it's also incredibly exciting. I'm going to do another ramble regarding Deus Ex, because that's another interesting kind of topic to kind of talk about, is augmentations, human augmentations, and what they mean. But yeah, so I'd love to know what you think about trips to Mars, or just kind of where humans are going to be in the future. It's really quite exciting to think that within our lifetimes people are going to be living on Mars, and I mean hopefully everything goes to plan and it works out well. And who knows, maybe one day somebody listening to this will actually be taking that trip themselves and going there, which would be amazing. So thank you so much for listening. Hope you've enjoyed this ramble. I'll catch you guys next time.